great. I love doing this. I'm so excited about this launch because Marge by Art Shimamura is one of my favorite papers that anyone's written about education. I think it's great. It's a book, basically. It's an e-book. And Nimish, I mean, was a perfect person to ask to get involved with the Inaction series. And I just think he's done an amazing job. So I just going to start off by saying, hello, Nimish, how are you?
I'm very good, thanks. You know, it's that wonderful feeling at the end of the term where I know colleagues in the room might have just over a week left, some maybe 3 days. I recognise some of the names from people within my own trust that I know are itching for the end of this week. So yeah, it's that feeling of getting close to the end of the term and a wonderful summer, and hopefully some of you will be purchasing the book and reading it over those 6 weeks.
Well, I wanted to say massive congratulations. I mean, I just want to flash out the book here. This book was officially released yesterday. Which is really, you know, a fantastic achievement. And I do think that it's not an insignificant thing to set about trying to engage with someone else's ideas and then to make it kind of really relevant for teachers. And you're a perfect person for doing that. You know, you're someone who's actually working in the classroom, and although you're working across a trust now, I know that, but it's still taking those ideas, putting them into practice. And for me, the inaction concept was really much that. Take a research paper and say, what does it mean in a classroom? And we started off with this one here, which last year, generative learning, and since then we've had a few of them. You've got a whole collection, haven't you? You want to wave them to people. Where's your inaction collection?
Right. Sorry, my internet just dropped out for a second then, so I hope it doesn't keep doing that. But yes, no. the whole set of them are here. So I do have the full suite.
And this is for me just a kind of an absolute classic. So I love the way you've got this sort of rhythm to it. So Marge has a structure, doesn't it? You've got we'll talk about that in a minute. And at the end of each chapter, you have this very punchy kind of table. And I'm a sucker for that. So I'm well aware, I've learned this from lots of different people, that when people read books, let's be honest, half the time you don't really read them. You flick through them and you're very, people are busy. And what you've created this thing is immediately you just go, oh, thank God there's a summary table on the back of each chapter. And you go, right, yeah, what is he saying? And that almost invites you in. So you start saying, okay, and then it draws you in, and those are so well crafted, and all the way through you've got these sort of loads of ideas, case studies, and it does. I think, well, how's Nimish going to take this paper that I love and make it kind of an ad? And that would be a challenge for anybody. But you've done an absolutely superb job. I'm just going to congratulate you. So I'm going to raise a glass to you and say, well done, congratulations on your book launch.
Thank you, sir.
And it's brilliant. I'm so thrilled. So let's just talk a bit about it. Now, I think we're going to start off by asking you about Art Shimamura, because there's a bit of a special mention for him because, you know, he passed away last October, I think. And so, but you did have contact with him before, didn't you? So tell us a bit about that. Where were you? What was your contact with Arthur Shimamura before he died?
It was a really sad story when I heard that he passed away. We'd been in contact quite a bit around May, June, July time in the early parts of the summer, and he'd been really excited about the project and being able to take the work that he'd put in place, which was really focused around ideas and theories around cognition, but also really focused at university students, because they're the students that he taught. And one of the things that he was always quite passionate about is how this can be used further across the educational sector, and that was one of the things that he discussed with me. And what we really got into it was trying to unpick, some of the key themes that keep coming up throughout the paper. So, where he's got the 3 C's that keep coming up, what he actually meant by those 3 C's, and how that there are slight differences between them. What his thoughts around motivation were, where, initially, when you think about motivation, you think about the idea of nudging norms and those sorts of ideas. And actually, as we dig further behind it, his idea was actually how we're using our instruction and the knowledge that we're delivering, and the whole idea of attaining new knowledge to actually lead students to be motivated to what they're doing. And with motivation and attention being two of the absolute areas of gold dust that people are digging into right now, it was a no-brainer to ask him more about his ideas around motivation and attention, and it was so amazing to hear from him his thoughts around that. It was really exciting to like discuss and go back and forth with his ideas around how what he's learned from neuroscience can impact cognitive science, as a scientist, as a physicist myself, the work that I've done where I did a lot of medical physics at university, and I remember seeing and being in MRI machines and being able to talk to him about the fMRI that he did was phenomenal, and it did appeal to the geek in me in a huge way to get a better understanding of the brain. When I got to those conversations and how that was actually applicable in the classroom, I could really see the craft in his thinking and how he slowly built this model of actually not just a singular piece of a Lego brick in terms of learning process, but actually a holistic model.
And it's fantastic. I mean, that's fantastic, and I'm so glad you could have that discussion, because nearly all the other papers the books in the series have had that contact. Of course, with me, the Rosenshine one that Rosenshine wasn't, had already passed away a few years ago, but all the other people who have had that link, and it's been so interesting having these people having dialogue with their researcher. It's kind of like you're sort of in awe of them initially, but you realise they're kind of fairly down to earth. But we had the kind of, you had the coup of getting Dan Winningham has written the foreword for your books. That's pretty awesome as well. So, I mean, I was going to read a bit out of this. I think this is great. He says he has this, and I'm going to trail this. People need to get it and read it. He talks about his own contact with Arthur Shimamura, who he met when he was a younger researcher, and he met him. But he says about you, he says, a danger with a book like this is that the author might convince himself that he's carrying the banner of truth into battle with the benighted, backed by the artillery of science. There's none of that overconfident zeal to be found here. I think it's great. Lad has done a beautiful job of explaining the principles of Marge. So that comes from Dan Winningham. So he must be pretty stoked about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we offer GCSE, well, we used to offer GCSE psychology and A-level psychology at my school, and Dan Winningham features on the curriculum in those areas. So I got to go in the next day and said, hi guys, I walked into the class on like a learning walk, and most of the students I taught before in the previous year. I said, well, hi guys, I know you're learning about Winningham later this year. Have you already covered parts of it in the curriculum? And they were like, yeah, we have. I said, well, look at this email that I received the other day. Have a read of this, and it was great in that sense. It was great to talk to the students about that, but it was also great for students to see that these people are normal, everyday people that engage with others and try to go through that process of learning. Dan Willingham's work has been hugely influential in my own thinking, and it was. I remember when I emailed yourself to say, can we give it a shot and see what he thinks, and sending the book over to him, the manuscript was a very nervous moment, and I remember sitting there thinking, I don't know what I'm going to get back, but what I got back, I couldn't have asked for anything better.
Oh, we've lost your sound there.
Oh, has it come back now?
No, you're back, yeah.
Right. Yeah, so I was just saying that, I couldn't have asked for anything better that came back from Dan Winningham. There were many things that I was nervous about when writing this book. That was one of the most nervous moments.
Well, isn't it great? See, what I love about this, the story of this whole thing for me, I don't know about your engagement, but I'm a massive fan of Ollie Lovell's output, and he does this great sort of compendium of things that he's picked up recently. And he shared on his thing, here's a tweet from Dan Winningham, and Dan Winningham was saying, Arthur Shimamura has just published an ebook called Marge, and to me, I'd never have heard of it. So I heard of it not even directly from Dan Winningham, but from Ollie Lovell, and it's all this sort of social media has allowed us to connect with people who are kind of researching, and I think that's amazing. And then you having that dialogue, I think it's like wonderful. But here's the thing I next want to ask you about, because I think this separates Marge, and I know this is the reason why some people find it particularly interesting, because it has this neuroscience aspect to it, which for some people is a bit taboo, because you don't really need to know this stuff to be a teacher. You really don't, but it's just fascinating. So, in the book, lovely diagram here. Look, Shimamura does start talking about the function of the brain and the parts of the only at a level which is useful. What does the prefrontal cortex do? And so, just from your take on it, I'm not going to sort of test you or anything, but for people reading this, why do you think it's interesting even or useful to have some understanding of that? Or do you think it's just sort of background knowledge which you can kind of skip over?
Leaning on the curriculum almost again. It's almost a bit like the hinterland in the curriculum sometimes, these sort of ideas, where actually it is that great background that couches why we're doing certain things that we're doing and why it makes such a difference. So, why retrieval practice works, why space practice works, you know, why we should try to do certain techniques when trying to direct students' attention. This understanding of the neuroscience behind the learning process really supports that. It really helps us understand why we're doing what we're doing, and then potentially consider how we can do that better. And I completely agree. While it's not necessary, I think it's important to consider the implications of some of the ideas that are within there, which is why I thought I'll dedicate a few pages to it, trim it back, and make it really useful in terms of what's within there. And I know that one of the people who did a review for me was Sarah Cottington, who's part of the Ambition Institute, who is currently going through a course in educational neuroscience, which I genuinely believe is going to become a big thing in the next couple of years.
I think what I've done really well, so people who, you know, are going to go and read this book, of course you are, is that you've done this really neat thing. So we're going to come to the MARGE in a minute, the MARGE, but what you've done is that you've kind of really condensed, because it's actually it's a bit of Shimamura's paper where I feel like you could get a bit bogged down in it, but you've just stripped it right back, and you've said, how does the whole discussion about the brain function explain each of those letters from the acronym really simply? It's such a brilliant a couple of pages, I have to say. It's like, and you've got this, and I do like this idea of this, a notion we can understand about this executive function of where we consciously, when we've got especially difficult concepts, and we actively, deliberately focus our attention on it, and I think it helps soften this sort of Dan Willingham originated, well, it's not even his originated, but we have this schematic diagram of the brain, of memory, working memory, long-term memory, which is a schematic, and we draw them as a box, and someone will then accuse people of simplifying learning to the point of absurdity, as if it's a box that fills up. And of course it isn't that. But what this does, it gives you this, it reminds you that it's organic,
yeah.
There's this organic complexity, which is absolutely mind-blowing, that it does what it can do. And then, but I just think that's great. So I mean, it's even like the last sentence, of that section, which just says, without the prefrontal cortex focusing on the right stimulus and evaluating the knowledge we have gained, the process of learning becomes obsolete. So it's got this idea that there's part of your brain which has this role. And anyway, so I mean, if you had to sort of recommend people, you know, I mean, I'm going to do it for you, because I just say your version of it is almost easier to engage with than it is in the original paper, I would argue. It's just really A1, so well done for that. Let's get into the MARGE then. So I'm not going to quit again. I don't want to, like, these chats aren't supposed to be like an interrogation, but I just think it'd be really interesting to hear your kind of key take on it. So what's your, like, let's start with motivation, M. What's the main message you feel like you get from Shimamura's paper about that?
So the key with motivation with me is that we're trying to find a way through our way of delivering information to students, or giving them an intro into the wider side of things, in terms of what we're about to go through, how we do that in such a way that it inspires a level of curiosity within the pupils, and then wanting to be left in a place where they're wanting to know more. And so much of that comes from the idea of questioning, or the idea of being really explicit with telling people to go and see things, and therefore bringing new experience on board. So, you know, the idea is about big picture questions, and really sort of opening up the curriculum to say, right, this will answer all of this for you, or begin to answer all of this for you, or have you considered this in this huge area? One of the favourite parts of the Motivate topic for me was this, or the Motivate chapter for me, was talking about this idea of you know, almost like leaving students hanging. It's like leaving them at the point where you're nearly there and just let go. So, you know, in terms of, like, say, Empire Strikes Back, you know, when the hand gets chopped up, when Luke's hand gets chopped up, and you find out, no more spoilers there, but yes, more spoilers after that point, that whole idea of just like leaving it there, leaving a film in a trilogy at that point. How often do we consider that idea of very good storytelling within our lessons? And it was those that really resonated with me. How do we actually motivate students throughout lesson structure, but also the curriculum, how that is structured to ensure students have this deep curiosity to learn more, rather than they're motivated to learn because they think it's a good thing to do.
Yeah, and that's so interesting. I mean, earlier today, I was reading Pep's, well, I was rereading because I read it before. It's such a short book, Pep's Gray's book on motivation, and sort of it sort of, because it's so interesting hearing the same thing approach from different people. But this is the key thing, and I feel like this is sometimes what you capture really well, is that motivation in this context isn't about sort of life goals and that sort of planning ahead. It's kind of helping students learn, because you create a mental motivation to keep focused. It's like it links to the attention, doesn't it? So the motivation to sort of keep focused and pay effort. It's like that sort of, I've got a budget of effort to spend, and I'm motivated to spend it on this because there's something I'm going to get from it, which is like answering a question, like the big question. So you've got some really good examples in here about these sort of big picture questions. And then there's also the storytelling. But one of the things I think is interesting, and this, again, I love this because it sort of softens some of the retrieval practice heavy kind of outcomes of cognitive science, is this thing of aesthetic questions. Like, so can you explain that? What is it? What, if people don't know what that is, what do we mean by aesthetic questions?
So I was really lucky to have Joanne Crofts, who's at the Hart School, who managed to write a case study on the idea of aesthetic questions for me. She talks about how it can be used in ethics to really ask around the issue, to ensure that the students are engaging with the content on a, almost like a very local level. So rather than as a whole class level, but individually, what does the content mean to that student? So if we're talking about if we're talking about ethics, and you say, well, do you think that's the right thing to do? Why would you think that's the right thing to do? How would you approach that situation? So by asking questions that are more emotional, potentially, in terms of how they're actually being asked, we're encouraging students to think deeply about areas where previously they would look for more of the, almost like the storytelling idea of cause and effect, or causality, where it's like, well, this causes this. Well, actually, well, should it? Is that what you really want to happen? Could we go a different route with this? And all those ideas just bring a different way for students to almost emotionally hook onto a concept.
Yeah, I really feel this is a kind of undercooked kind of aspect of some of the more recent things which have ended up focusing on what we'll come to the generate evaluate, is because I feel like if you can, and this is what Peps is also saying, like if you can crack motivation, boy, the rest of it flies. And this is the thing of students don't even not want to be motivated. They want to be. It's just that they've sometimes struggled to be because they've got so many things going on. And so if you can hook it and say, what's the big question and does it matter to you? You're like, yeah, let's make it matter. Let's make it feel like I care about the outcome of this inquiry that we're engaged in. And so I'm going to stay around to find out if I can answer the question. I love it. I think it's a superb concept. And again, you've got some lovely ideas. So that ethics example, which is in biology, it's like ethics in biology. It wasn't just ethics in ethics. It's like it's bringing in that aesthetic kind of feeling of like, why should you care about this? And it's not because you need to know this in 10 years' time when you're doing a possible job or something. It's right here and now in the concept. It's great. So then we move. So, and again, it's like, this is just to highlight. So what Nimish has done is he's got this table at the end of each chapter, and he says, so what is it? Focus on this and be wary of this. And one of the things you talk about is shoehorning storytelling where it's not appropriate. So people have got, oh, yeah, storytelling's good, and then you're thinking, like, let's not just do that because it's a good thing. It has to be where it's authentic, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's one of these. I remember as I was writing each chapter, I was thinking, how am I going to make sure that actually the point that I'm trying to get across is landing? And actually, it came out of a feature of like emails and communication that I send out. As in, how do I give an example of actually what I want, and how do I give an example of what I don't want? I thought to myself as I was writing the book, well, actually, it's the same thing. How many books have I read? And then I've tried something out, and then I've heard somebody else's take on it. I thought, oh yeah, actually, it could be this instead. And then I've gone away and thought, well, yeah, let me refine what I'm doing. So I thought to myself, how can I crystallize each chapter to the point of the 3 or 4 key main areas? You know, what actually is it, so people know what I'm talking about. How can we get it working, but also what might it look like if it starts going wrong, so you can identify when things are going wrong and stop that trajectory before it goes too far down the line. And to be fair, when I put that table together, the very first one, there's a bit of a revelationary moment to me where I thought, well, actually, this is the way that I should approach a lot of communication, full stop. And when I think about communication now, I think about how am I making things clear, and I thought that those tables just do that for me. That really simply make it crystal clear exactly what some of the thinking could be around it. But it also leaves it open for people to find their own interpretation within an area without straying too far outside the lines that could make it ineffective.
Yeah, and I do think so. And the reality check is that a lot of busy teachers will just read those tables and go, okay, I kind of, hopefully I get the gist of this, and it's really powerful. And this is an interesting, like with ascetic questions, you talk about one thing to be wary of is accepting the opinions of students over facts within the subject. And so the personal response is a way of them hooking into the subject, but you don't just start saying, therefore, whatever you have to say about it has more value than the inherent value of the content. And again, that's so great to have that in there, because otherwise someone's going to go, you know, how do you feel about this knowledge, and anything, you know, whatever you think is okay. And sometimes that's just, there's a real subtlety there around about that issue. So I think that's really well done. Okay, so let's talk about attention. Isn't it? It's one of the things I remember. I think for me, like it's I think which stands out for me reading the ebook is this study, which you have on your page 36. Shimamura mentioned that classroom studies have shown that mind wandering is rampant. I love that word, rampant. Only 40 to 46% of students paying attention to a lecture at any given moment in a university. So that's, to me, is like, it's kind of brutal, but almost reassuring that it's a kind of human nature that when you're teaching a class of kids, of students, half of them perhaps are not with you at any one time. And it's not because they're feckless, it's because they're kind of, it's hard for them to pay attention, meant a focus because there's so much in their head. So what's your kind of, what are the ways that we deal with focusing attention?
So the thing with attention, we talk about, you know, there almost is like this motivational bank account in a student's mind in terms of how much effort they can give towards motivation. Well, I think the same thing is really occurring with attention as well, where actually, and Shimamura says it, that attention takes effort. It's an active process, and it needs that conscious awareness of learning goals. And actually, it's that whole idea of learning goals where we take something that's very, very big to draw people in, and then start to break it down to things that really matter, to almost like sequencing that order to ensure long-term learning takes place. It's that whole idea of almost being, and my students absolutely hammer me for this. You know, I still teach quite a lot of lessons, and actually every time either someone's come to see me teach or some students comment on my teaching, you know, whenever they come at the end of the year and talk to me, the key thing that they say to me, and I've just said it again then, is quite often in my lessons is I say, this is key. And I never realized why I actually do this. And when I read the attention chapter, I thought, well, I know exactly why I'm doing this. These are those bits that I want the students to pay attention to more than anything else. These are the hooks upon which everything else is hung at the end of the day. And what I realized as I started to watch back some of my lessons or ask people to watch me in more detail was, you know, I hooked it always around the explicit learning goals. Those 3 questions that I'd whack up at the lesson, at the start of the lesson. I said, right, we need to get through these today. Every single time I got into this is key, it would be because I was going back to one of those explicit learning goals. If it wasn't that, it was because it was a specific chunk of those learning goals. And it was that whole idea of being able to explicitly direct a student's attention that made it realize to me, that made me realize essentially that actually attention is key. There we go. So again, attention is absolutely key there, and directing it is so important.
Well, totally. I mean, and it's sort of, it's that thing of like rehearsing it over and over again. It's like, and it's a bit like, repetition, you know, of anything. You might not have caught it the first time, and when learning is transient, and I love the way that all these things link. So when you talk to Ollie Lovell about the cognitive load theory, one of the and Ollie Caviglioli, who my partner in crime, he basically thinks cognitive load theory is basically transience. They say that's it. It's because stuff has gone and it's hot, and whereas if it's still there and you can keep looking at it, it's easier to engage with it. So compare two things, we'll look at them at the same time. And then, or if you've told me something, but it's still written, I can remember what you said because it's there right in front of me. Whereas if you have to kind of try to make effort. And so for me, this thing of like keeping it present helps you focus on it because it's still there. And I love all this sort of connecting. So one of the things I think is really interesting though in this attention is this thing of taking a guided tour. So seeing a kind of this idea that there's a kind of journey, like if it's all a bit confusing or what's this and where are we and what's it all about, it's a bit, you scatter brain about it, don't you? But he suggests you kind of deliberately take a guided tour, sort of map out. Do you think that's something which you automatically do or that teachers always do? What do you feel about that?
I think it's such an interesting thing to consider, and I think conversations on social media around education right now are really focused around the importance of subject knowledge in terms of our delivery. And when you think about other professions with as high levels of subject knowledge, you think about tour guides. They have a ridiculously high amount of subject knowledge around whatever they're taking people around and whatever they're showing. And therefore, if we take that model and apply it to teaching, it's the same idea. If people have a high level of subject knowledge regarding whatever they're talking about, they can really start to unpick students' attention and really ensure that they know exactly which bits are crucial for whatever's coming up. And therefore, it is completely a model that can be used in the classroom. I think teachers naturally get to a point where they become tour guides through the content of the curriculum. However, to refine their practice and to get it even better, it's about how well do they know the knowledge around the curriculum. The best tour guides have the best subject knowledge around whatever they're taking you around. They know things that no one else knows. And it's exactly the same thing when it comes to teaching. If we have that ridiculously high level of knowledge, so when we're talking about, I don't know, say we're talking about beams of light, or we're talking about light from the sun, we could talk about waves. We talk about waves and photons, and the difference between waves and photons, and how people have thought about the ideas of photons being used on solar sails in space to be able to use as a method of propulsion. All of that is like really cool, and you can get people thinking about a photon in more detail, or light in more detail, or light can actually be used for propulsion. And actually, while that is off topic, the idea is you've got students focused now on the area of light and the fact that light can be more than what we first thought it was. And that's where I really think this whole idea of directing students' attention by using this idea of being a tour guide, I think is so important.
And if nothing else, I mean, I think what Shimamura, for me, is I think I refer to this nearly every training session I do, is that attention is something you have to generate. You can't just ask for it. You can't just say, okay, everybody, please pay attention. Because even if they want to, they might not be able to, because they are fighting competing forces for their attention. And like, you have to sort of say, let me help you pay attention on this by giving them a task or guiding them through, or making them think in a certain way, which we'll come to in a minute with the 3 C's. And it's that type of thing of not assuming attention is just freely given, because it often isn't the case. And I just think it's, again, the motivate, attend combine together really well. I feel like for me, there's another sort of the next 3 kind of like then follow on from that, like the relate. Now this is, I want to come on with the 3 C's now, because you, like you said, I mean, we discussed this when you were writing the book, that he introduces the 3 C's in the attend, but then it's really more core in the relate in terms of schema forming. And they compare, contrast, and categorize. Now, there's a kind of bit of a debate with, again, Oliver and other people. Are there really only 2 C's? I mean, what's the difference between compare and contrast? Could you resolve this for us?
Well, I'm not sure I can, but I'll say what Shimamura said to me. So it was one of the first questions I asked Professor Shimamura was around this idea of what is the difference of compare and contrast, and his viewpoint, I think, was where I first thought it was as well in terms of his difference. So compare, he's saying we're looking more at similarities and how things are very, very similar to each other. And contrast, he considered to be things are very, very different. If I'm talking about it within a science lesson, I'm saying there's not too much difference between those 2 in terms of how I would discuss them, but that was how he phrased them, and therefore that's what he was expecting people to do. To say, if we're saying we're comparing different areas of knowledge, we're saying, well, how is the climate of Africa similar to the climate of South America, and therefore what relational links can we make about climates in certain hemispheres or certain parts of the world? And that was his whole idea behind the 3Cs. The whole idea, therefore, of categorization was therefore taking that and saying, well, right, that therefore sits in this category because of that. It's almost like finding ways to group things together and then putting them in a group.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and it's sort of, I mean, contrast is really kind of an extra emphasis on difference, isn't it? Where it's a part of a comparison, and you could compare two things and find that they were very similar, and that's the main thing that you draw from them. Or contrast isn't quite the way you'd express what you observe. So I do think it's different, and it makes you think harder about contrast. Like, can you contrast these two? It's when you think I'm about to contrast them, I'm thinking of them about automatically I start doing this in my hands. That's how I'm thinking.
Yeah.
And I just think I do think it's different, and he explains that well, and so do you. So he then has lots of these things like relational models, and it's super practical. I mean, this is a great in-action chapter. You've got mnemonics. You talk about mental movies, metaphors, analogies, all these different ways of helping ideas make sense. And it's this central thing of learning, isn't it, of connecting new stuff to what we already know, and therefore relating things to what you already know. It's something you have to do very intentionally, and you've got it links to concept maps. It's such a punchy and sort of pithy, I'm trying to say, chapter. I think it's great. It's just, is there one thing from there, like, you know, that you feel like is more tricky or complicated, or that people might need to do? I mean, and mental movies, for example. I mean, what is that? I mean, that sounds nice to do, but how can you actually do that? How does that work?
Yeah, and mental movies was a really interesting one. And I was lucky as we were constructing this chapter that I had Dawn Espol, who works read alongside me, who wrote the vast majority of the chapter. But we had long discussions over some of these ideas, and mental movies was one of them. I'm really lucky that Dawn is a vice principal for teaching learning, but also a teacher of film and media studies. So she had a very good grasp of mental movies the second I mentioned it. But the whole idea is how do we sequence a process, or how can we get a sequence process into a student's mind in terms of how things stitch together as part of the big story. So if we're talking something about the life cycle of a butterfly or something like that, or how a plant grows over time and the effect of auxins on it, we could actually do that as a story. So it goes back to the whole idea of harnessing storytelling, but actually we can use that story to explain what's happening rather than as a motivational factor. So, you know, this happens and this happens and this happens. It's that whole idea of things occurring in a way that allows you to map things over a period of time. And you know, we can say what we want about how students learn and the wide variety of things there. But what we do know is when students are trying to reframe knowledge in their own mind, we know that they're more likely to make a relational link. And therefore, if we give the time for students to do that by forming these mental movies, we'll be able to make more of these stronger relational links.
I think it's so interesting. And you know, again, I just feel like I just love this process of lots of ideas sort of having their moment, but then over time they weave together. So for me, well, this resonates with the generative learning book, which is actually one of the other ones in the series here, this one. And in there's this process of imagining. So one of the things is that you think, like, for example, it could be imagining how ice floats or condensation or any sort of particle behavior. The scale of it is so small, we can't, and everyone has to imagine it. No one can visualize it totally accurately. So you're thinking, oh, how does that work? And that's like this thing of a kind of mental movie. What's going on in this process underneath? But there's also things like in understanding literature, you know, the character is in that situation, and can you kind of imagine what it would have felt like? Well, you have to give space in the lesson to allow students to try to imagine it. So what would it have been like? Why would they have behaved in that way? And you're sort of playing this idea, connecting the text and the language to a scenario you might try to relate to. I just think that intentionality of bridging and connecting is so important, isn't it? And often you just think, I don't know, I think I do see lessons where that isn't given enough space, because you can't see kids imagining. or making a mental movie. So you think, how do I know they're doing it? So you have to sort of set it up at least, and then ask them maybe to tell you. I mean, is it something, but that's just one of them, obviously. The thing like relational diagrams, which is tangible, and you see it, the schematic is more obvious, isn't it? Because I can see I've done that. But when you're just asking students to do something in their head, you have to have a process. How does that relate to your experience? Do you feel like some of those things are more likely to be done because they're more sort of readily testable?
Yeah, and staff will see something, instantly see how that can apply to their practice and go with that. And just to add to the point you mentioned, I think it's a really pertinent point to mention that when we consider MARGE, we shouldn't consider it like a checklist, like literally go through each one of you to them off as you're doing it. And actually, a lot of these are related. The ideas are related together. So when you were just talking about the idea of mental movies and almost like the question to ask around it, I think, well, a lot of those are aesthetic questions. And actually, therefore, while we're getting students to relate this idea in their mind, we're getting them to pay attention to certain things by asking these. We're getting to motivate to think about certain ideas by asking these aesthetic questions. We're getting to pay attention to certain things by being really explicit with some of the questions that we ask. And therefore, this isn't I'm going to motivate them, then I'm going to make them pay attention, then I'm going to make them relate ideas together. It's not that. When we're considering an activity with a lesson that leads to learning taking place, all of these things can fall into play in a really quick way. So, when we're picking the idea of mental movies, it's great to see these things come together. In terms of ideas that are really quick and easy to pick up, schematic representations, I agree completely. You can, when we're structuring an explanation, it follows this very schematic structure quite often. But also when we're applying those 3 C's, once you've grasped, all right, I've got these 2 areas of the knowledge of my domain that are quite similar, and these 2 areas that are quite different. So let me see what students can actually gain from this, and can they actually place them in different categories, and can we actually start to make a wider knowledge base for our students by doing that?
Yeah, I just think it's such an important part. I really do that relate. It's connecting. It's it's linking to the most concrete thing and then building on that, and then abstraction is really kind of exemplified through actual examples, and which leads into the next thing. So another thing, I don't know about you, but for me this becomes the generate evaluate. They sort of go together, and for me this has become like a touchstone of understanding learning and lessons, is that you don't know if you know something until you've gone through a cycle of generate evaluate. You don't. So you can stare at information, and this happens, this illusion of knowing is such a big thing. So you can look at facts. It's a bit like you look at some words in French and you can read them and go, I know what they all mean, and I can understand that whole sentence. But now if you close the book, could you say it? And you think, well, so generating things, so there's so many different levels there. Or just recognizing people's names, like actors or something. I know who all those people are, but if I had to generate names, so you don't know if you know it properly until you kind of test your knowledge and then evaluate if you're correct. And I think that's, for me, generate, evaluate is like core knowledge for teachers. It's so brilliant. It's so brilliant. It's just like punchy, simple, and therefore get every student to generate some sense of, do you know it? And then evaluate it. Did you get it right? Which did you get wrong? And you capture this so well. So one of the technical things you explore really nicely is just the generation effect and the production effect. Now that's a bit nerdy, but just because you're the expert here, what is the difference? What is the generation effect and the production effect? Do we need to be bothered about this?
Yeah, so there is a slight difference between the 2 things. And yes, I did get incredibly nerdy when I wrote that part of the chapter. Like, I still remember my first draft, which I wrote, and I didn't look up at how much I'd actually written, and it ended up being like nearly 8 pages just on this little bit. I thought, well, no, this isn't right. I need to take this right back. So the idea behind the generation effect and the production effect is, a generation effect is talking about where you're giving cues to students so they've got an idea about whatever we're trying to get them to generate, and therefore they can generate that idea for themselves. So the idea that Shimamura discusses is the idea of putting the words waste and garbage next to each other, one of them with some of the letters blanked out, and therefore they can predict what that word's going to be. And what he says through the studies that he's done in the 90s was that that students are more likely to remember knowledge if they've generated it. What he then said was, actually also, if they then do something with that, so if they produce something with that knowledge very quickly after generating it, they're even more likely to remember it. So that whole idea of using the generation effect and the production effect was like an instant change in my teaching from after reading this. So as a simple example, when labeling diagrams, I thought, well, actually, what are the words that are going to be on this diagram? The vast majority of the students know. I think I was teaching anatomy, or potentially something about the skeletal system at the time. So I thought, right, let me just put up some of these names of bones that because students know I'm talking about bones, and I'll just leave some of the letters left out, see if they can generate what the words actually are, and then let's do something with it straight away. Let's actually label a diagram and let's see what they're actually like in terms of retaining that information. And it genuinely showed that they retained that information for a longer period of time, because not only did they generate it through cues, but they also used it and produced something with it straight away. And I saw literally the week after I spoke to a food teacher about it, them doing it in a food lesson, talking about a process of cooking food and some of the utensils and the recipes that were used there.
So it's so simple, isn't it? It's like, again, you feel like if that's a study thing, I mean, it's something which should be more widely understood, that this idea of just sort of populating your working memory with the knowledge that is sort of part is there, but you get cued to generate it with help, like filling in the missing letters on the word is quite strongly cued. But then there's the simple act of doing that, but then producing it the next time without that, just saying it or applying it, that to me is like it makes a lot of sense with language, and so that I think that's useful. And then the 3 C's, so compare, contrast, categorize, comes in again, because you're asking people to generate things by saying compare, contrast. Categorize is obvious, isn't it? Like, organize this information into the categories you know, and that could be what advantages, disadvantages, or actual categories like vertebrates and invertebrates in science. But it could just be any type of structure, the way knowledge is organized. Is that what that means?
Yeah, so, and it's really interesting, because one of the examples that I remember, my wife works in a primary school, and I remember going around there and just talking to some of the teachers one day, and one of the things I saw was a key stage history lesson. They were talking about ancient civilizations, and they talked about the idea of ancient Egypt and ancient Greece, and I remember the teacher there asking someone to compare the two, asking this class to compare the two. And actually, by them doing that, they could generate further ideas about, well, if they're similar in this way, does that also mean they're similar in this way? And then, therefore, by being able to do that comparison, it makes it really interesting for students to almost like not predict new learning, but almost like start to make theories and therefore test to see what's actually going to happen. So I'm assuming that they might actually have similar ideas around the sorts of food they eat, or similar ideas around the climate, or similar ideas around sort of buildings that they build, and that is where things get really, really interesting, because students are actually getting to a point where their understanding is allowing them to almost like stitch things together, and then all of a sudden they see the gap and think, oh gosh, that must mean all of this comes together. I mean, I know I'm talking to a fellow ex-science teacher, and it's that whole idea of what Mendeleev did with the periodic table. He saw the gaps and he was like, right, okay, cool, there must be something there. And it's the same sort of idea that I picked up when we were talking about testing each other with the 3 C's.
No, it's interesting. And so what I like about that is it gives you a structure to generative processes and and aspects of retrieval practice. So I really think there's a lovely sort of Venn diagram we could draw of concepts between the generative learning and MARGE, which is that it's kind of some of the ways in which you can generate in the MARGE is through the 8 strategies in generative learning, and which include self-testing but also explaining and this I won't go into that whole one, but they do, all these ideas are not like sort of disconnected. They overlap, obviously, because it's about the same process. And last of all, E, the evaluate, and really this is a sort of, you deal with it as one of the key things, the illusion of knowing. I do this in my CPD quite regularly, which is to teach some words to people, and they have a table and they can see the words and their meaning, and you say to them, do you think you know what they mean? And they look at them and go, yeah, because yeah, I get that. And then you do a little test and take half of the definitions off and half the words off, and they go, oh my God, like I don't know them. I thought I did know them, but I don't know them because now I can't. It's that you have to, and getting students to genuinely evaluate the extent of the knowledge. So flashcards, one of your ones is flashcards. Such an obvious thing, isn't it? But it's that, so knowing the reason. The reason is to test, to evaluate. And when you have a framework for it, the reason for flashcards is to evaluate your knowledge. And I think that's a better word than test, isn't it? Because it's like, it's not just do I know it, it's how well do I know it. Evaluate has a more kind of qualitative kind of feel, like to what extent do I know it? How readily could I remember it? How much did I remember? So are you a big fan of flashcards? Or do you...
Yes, I am. And I remember speaking to Joanne Jukes, who wrote the chapter. And when we were talking about the use of flashcards, I used to use them in a huge way. But what I realized when I was writing this chapter was, and when I actually read MARGE in the first place, was that I was actually using them incorrectly, in the sense of I was using it as, well, not necessarily incorrectly, but inefficiently, I think is the phrase to use, where actually I wasn't getting the best out of them. Where I realized the best place to use them was, using them for a very clear system where we're breaking things away when we don't know them at all, and therefore using them more often, or breaking them away in terms of we know those areas quite well, so don't look at them as much, but then building that almost time, that idea of space practice to allow time for forgetting to occur before we recheck. The whole thing I found with flashcards is exactly what you're saying there. How we're using flashcards as a way of checking that what we think we remember, we have actually remembered. Because quite often you could say, we talk about metacognitive strategies. Thinking metacognitively is hard, and we know it's hard to think in that way. So we need to build in very specific strategies that students have, so they can think about their thinking or think about their learning in a really specific way. And flashcards is certainly one of those. That whole idea of that illusion of knowing can only be overcome when students realise that they don't know something. It's the only way to do it. Everyone thinks they know something until they realise that they don't. And flashcards is one of the best ways to do that. They'll look at the front of the card and it will say something on it, and they're like, cool, yeah, I know that. They turn it around, oh no, it wasn't that, I said this bit instead. But there's so much modelling that needs to happen with that. We really need to model to the students how to construct the card, what to accept as part of the answer to the card, not like a little part of the answer, but the whole answer. But that also ties back to construction again. And I think one of the chapters I talked a little bit about knowledge quiz construction and why knowledge quiz construction is so important, and the level of specificity that's required around it to allow these sort of things to happen. Because if we don't do it correctly, all we're doing is we're leaving gaps where we're not essentially getting the most effective use out of these strategies that we're putting in place.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously this is, there are lots of other ways, and you're talking about a kind of elaborative interrogation process, like you've got a prompt, and then do I know all of this? How much do I know? How much? You can't always summarize all of that on a flashcard. So you've got this sort of, it's a part of a retrieval process, and of course then weaving knowledge you can just retrieve into something more like extended, like a piece of extended writing, and there are other types of things. I think it's interesting, like, because you might think it's just for knowledge-based things, but I actually seen these used for prompts for discussions, prompts for practical processes, and I do think it's worth people seeing a wide application. So it's like, I mean, it's hard to summarize the whole book, but I think you did a reasonable job there. Like, it's Shimamura weaves all these things together, and it's this whole brain learning thing. It's sort of, they all interconnect, don't they? So that's what I really love about MARGE, is the way that the motivate and attend go together, and then relational models, how things will connect to what you already know and to each other, and then generate, evaluate. It's a very powerful and wide-reaching, expansive thing. And sometimes when people say cognitive science is a bit reductive and stuff, I just think, well, it isn't really.
No, not at all.
It's giving us the tools to kind of barely get a handle on something that inherently complicated, and it sort of gives us a language to discuss difficult things. Now, Amy has asked a really good question, and I actually invite other people to add questions at this point. You refer to 3 C's throughout: A, R, and G, attend, relate, generate. Would you advise colleagues best to have 3 C's in their own schema before engaging with the book? So, in other words, do we need to know what compare, contrast, and categorize are as ideas before we can really make sense of the book?
Yeah, I'd certainly say that is something that I initially struggled with when I was reading the paper, and thus I emailed Professor Shimamura to ask a bit more about it. So the first time, the three C's I mentioned, I think I give a very clear table with definitions about what Shimamura meant for each of these. And I think understanding what each of those actually are before going further forward, I think is a really important thing to do. Once we've got a good understanding in terms of our own schema, in terms of those words, we can then start applying it as we go throughout it. And the joy of books like this is, as you're reading it, you'd say, right, okay, you get to your action section and you see how these ideas work in action, and you think, right, how does this work in action for what I'm doing right now on Monday morning, or whatever it may be. And therefore understanding the three C's like really strongly in your own mind before then taking it as it comes further in the book is just as important.
Yeah, I mean, I'm forever going into lessons and seeing organizing ideas.
Yeah.
And, you know, and it can be adjectives, you know, and types of phrases. You know, I was in a primary school a couple of weeks ago where they, you know, got year 3s and 4s talking about subordinating conjunctions and so on. And there's, you know, knowledge is being organized for them. And of course, they just need to know the examples of those so to make their sentences more interesting. So they keep saying and they were understanding this. Because that was a categorization process, but they didn't need to know that. But the teacher being intentional about saying, let's look at the way these two things work, and kind of organizing words into groups of words for their function at that one level. And there's so many, and it could be, I saw an amazing lesson about a play where the students who are a bit older were going through the timeline of kind of the atmosphere being optimistic and pessimistic through each of the acts in the play. And so you've got optimistic, pessimistic. It's sort of, these are the structures we use to organize ideas, don't we, to help us make sense of things, so it's not just a big mush of, you know, like you need to have hooks for things, and those things are categories, which then help you to make comparisons. It's a powerful idea, but I think what Amy is saying there is that you need to have a way of expressing that in your subject, not just, they're not generic ideas when it comes down to it, are they?
100%. We do need to understand what does it mean for me in my subject and in what I'm doing day to day, and how might it look different. And, you know, for a leader, it's important to understand why it might look different from one subject to another.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So Sam has said, really interested in your comment towards the end of using MARGE to develop your conscious competence as a teacher. Do you see a use for the model as a framework for teacher learning? Have you applied it to your own CPD in your trust?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. As I'm doing more and more work around teacher development and CPD, I've started to unpick quite heavily how MARGE actually is part of that, because actually, as Sam mentions, a lot of CPD is about teacher learning. So therefore, well, if that's learning, and we're talking about learning as the process that Shimamura discusses, then we need to ensure that we're following this sort of model of MARGE in some way. So I'm at the very early stages of my thinking on it, but I can certainly see how it's applicable. You know, staff need to feel motivated that what they're about to do is going to make a difference to their practice. They need to know what are the key elements of this practice that they're going to need to put in place in terms of what they're doing. How does this relate to things they already know and therefore are already applying within their classrooms? How can actually, by stitching a few of these things together, can they start to go through this process of generate and evaluate, where they can or they can actually see, well, this looks like X, Y, Z in my subject, or this looks like X, Y, Z in your subject, and then how are we going to check to see that's actually happened? How have I understood whatever idea actually is? And therefore, the whole process of teacher learning, just like any learning process, can be framed by this, but that's what it is, it's a framework and not a checklist. So I certainly see how we can start to make a difference. And interesting enough, one of the ideas I've considered is how do we get staff motivated about a range of ideas around cognitive science, around teaching and learning, around curriculum, around behaviour. How can we get staff interested in those ideas to allow them to almost get to a point of, right, now they're motivated to know more about it. They know what the key things that schools are asking them to pay attention to. How much of the rest of this process can teachers find out about through reading papers and therefore going away and seeing what does school look like in action? So certainly I think it's an important part of teacher development.
Yeah, I mean, I know that just even the response when you said that you were going to do this book on Twitter, and that people who, a lot of people have read it, but what I think is going to be good is a lot of people are going to go to read it now because you're kind of promoting it, and it's like all these things, you're sort of paying respects to Shimamura in writing it himself, and you're amplifying his ideas. But I do think it does work, doesn't it? So it basically asks a question each time: motivate. To what extent are you deliberately engaging your students in processes which motivate them to focus their attention? And those two things, just one flows into the other, because you can't have one without the other, and you need to think consciously about that. And then that thing at the end: are you empowering your students to have the skills to evaluate their own knowledge? How do they know it? And they need to learn to test it. So you're, like you said, modeling. I like that when you said that about flashcards. Like, you have to model everything about it so that they understand the value of it. And then it's relational models of, trying to create order out of inherent complexity is inherent in nearly every discipline that we teach in schools. And that's what we're trying to do, so that we can then lead us to remembering it more easily. So all of these things will overlap. It's so fascinating. Well, look, I think it's brilliant. I just hearing you talk, I just love it. This is why we wanted to make this series, because and lots of people have recognized this, that researchers are researchers and teachers are teachers, and the way you express MARGE is not the same way Shimamura does, and it's different, it's deeper, it's more actionable, and I just think it's really great. I think you've done a really epic job. It's so fantastic. So I wanted to say thanks to you again. Congratulations once again. Well done for writing this great book, and I hope lots of people promote it, share it, and spread the word. So thank you to Nimish. Thank you to everyone for joining us for this chat. It's been a real blast talking to you, and I can't wait to see, next term, when people have got a bit of a break, there'll be a fresh wave of love for MARGE and for Nimish's great book. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for joining us. If you're watching the recording, thank you for watching, and goodbye for now. Thank you, everybody.